and a proud young man in diadem and ermine, attended by a retinue of pages, stood for his cousin, the reigning Duke of Pianura. A mist, as usual at that hour, was rising from the marshes between Pontus Ordo and Pianura, and the light soon ebbed from the saint's face, leaving the chapel in obscurity. Odo had crept there that afternoon with a keener sense than usual of the fact that life was hard on little boys, and though he was cold and hungry and half afraid, the solitude in which he cowered seemed more endurable than the noisy kitchen where at that hour the farmhands were gathering for their polenta, and Filipina was screaming at the frightened orphan who carried the dishes to the table. He knew, of course, that life at Pontus Ordo would not last forever, that in time he would grow up and be mysteriously transformed into a young gentleman with a sword and laced coat, who would go to court and perhaps be an officer in the Duke's army or in that of some neighbouring prince. But viewed from the lowliness of his 9 years, that dazzling prospect was too remote to yield much solace for the cuffs and sneers, the ragged shoes and sour bread of the present. The fog outside had thickened, and the face of Odo's friend was now discernible only as a spot of pallor in the surrounding dimness. Even he seemed farther away than usual, withdrawn into the fog, as into that mist of indifference which lay all about Odo's hot and eager spirit. The child sat down among the gourds and medlars on the muddy floor and hid his face against his knees. He had sat there a long time when the noise of wheels and the crack of a postilion's whip roused the dogs chained in the stable. Odo's heart began to beat. What could the sounds mean? It was as though the flood tide of the unknown were rising about him and bursting open the chapel door to pour in on his loneliness. It was, in fact, Filipina who opened the door, crying out to him in an odd Easter Sunday voice, the voice she used when she had on her silk neckerchief and gold chain or when she was talking to the bailiff. Odo sprang up and hid his face in her lap. She seemed of a sudden nearer to him than anyone else, a last barrier between himself and the mystery that awaited him outside.
"Come, you poor sparrow," she said,
dragging him across the threshold of the chapel.
"The abbot is here asking for you."
And she crossed herself as though she had named a saint. Odo pulled away from her with a last wistful glance at St. Francis, who looked back at him in an ecstasy of commiseration.
"Come, come,"
Filipina repeated, dropping to her ordinary key as she felt the resistance of the little boy's hand.
"Have you no heart, you wicked child? But to be sure, the poor innocent doesn't know. Come, Cavaliere, your illustrious mother waits."
"My mother?" The blood rushed to his face, and she called him Cavaliere.
"Not here, my poor lamb. The abbot is here. Don't you see the lights of the carriage? There, go to him. I haven't told him, your reverence. It's my silly tender-heartedness that won't let me. Well, he's always been like one of my own creatures to me."
And she confounded Odo by bursting into tears. The abbot stood on the doorstep. He was a tall, stout man with a hooked nose and lace ruffles. His nostrils were stained with snuff, and he took a pinch from a tortoise-shell box set with the miniature of a lady. Then he looked down at Odo and shrugged his shoulders. Odo was growing sick with apprehension. It was 2 days before the appointed time for his weekly instruction, and he had not prepared his catechism. He had not even thought of it. And the abbot could use the cane. Odo stood silent and envied girls who are not disgraced by crying. The tears were in his throat, but he had fixed principles about crying. It was his opinion that a little boy who was a cavaliere might weep when he was angry or sorry, but never when he was afraid. So he held his head high and put his hand to his side as though to rest it on his sword. The abbot sneezed and tapped his snuff-box.
Come, Cavaliere, you must be brave, you must be a man. You have duties, you have responsibilities. It's your duty to console your mother. The poor lady is plunged in despair. Well, what's that? You haven't told him? Cavaliere, your illustrious father is no more.
Odo stared a moment without understanding. Then his grief burst from him in a great sob, and he hid himself against Filomena's apron, weeping for the father in Damascened armour and scarlet cloak.
Come, said the abbot impatiently. Is supper laid? For we must be gone as soon as the mist rises.
He took the little boy by the hand.
Would it not distract your mind to recite the catechism? He inquired. No, cried Odo with redoubled sobs. Well, then, as you will. What a madman, he exclaimed to Filipina. I warrant it hasn't seen its father 3 times in its life. Come in, Cavaliere. Come to supper.
Filipina had laid a table in the stone chamber known as the bailiff's parlour, and thither the abbot dragged his charge and set him down before the coarse tablecloth covered with earthen platters. A tallow dip threw its flare on the abbot's big aquiline face as he sat opposite Odo, gulping the hastily prepared frittura and the thick purple wine in its wicker flask. Odo could eat nothing. The tears still ran down his cheeks, and his whole soul was possessed by the longing to steal back and see whether the figure of the knight in the scarlet cloak had vanished from the chapel wall. The abbot sat in silence, gobbling his food like the old black pig in the yard. When he had finished, he stood up, exclaiming,
Death comes to us all, as the hawk said to the chicken. You must be a man, Cavaliere.
Then he stepped into the kitchen and called out for the horses to be put to. The farmhands had slunk away to one of the outhouses, and Filomena and Jacopone stood bowing and curtsying as the carriage drew up at the kitchen door. In a corner of the big vaulted room, the little foundling was washing the dishes, heaping the scraps in a bowl for herself and the fowls. Odo ran back and touched her arm. She gave a start and looked at him with frightened eyes. He had nothing to give her, but he said, "Goodbye, Momola." And he thought to himself that when he was grown up and had a sword, he would surely come back and bring her a pair of shoes and a panettone. The abbot was calling him, and the next moment he found himself lifted into the carriage amid the blessings and lamentations of his foster parents. And with a great baying of dogs and clacking of whipcord, the horses clattered out of the farmyard and turned their heads toward Pianura. The mist had rolled back, and fields and vineyards lay bare to the winter moon. The way was lovely, for it skirted the marsh where no one lived, and only here and there the tall black shadow of a crucifix ate into the whiteness of the road. Shreds of vapour still hung about the hollows, but beyond these fold on fold of translucent hills melted into a sky dewy with stars. Odo cowered in his corner, staring out awestruck at the unrolling of the strange white landscape. He had seldom been out at night, and never in a carriage, and there was something terrifying to him in this flight through the silent moon-washed fields, where no oxen moved in the furrows, no peasants pruned the mulberries, and not a goat's bell tinkled among the oaks. He felt himself alone in a ghostly world from which even the animals had vanished, and at last he averted his eyes from the dreadful scene and sat watching the abbot, who had fixed a reading lamp at his back, and whose hooked-nosed shadow, as the springs jolted him up and down, danced overhead like the huge Pulcinella at the fair at Pontus Ordo.